We have an open Q&A session if any of the attendees want questions. If not, I'll just keep asking really annoying questions and see what my panelists will respond to. So maybe even to start off, before we get the ball going, it's always interesting, and I always find it interesting when colleagues, even just if anyone wants to give some ideas about any kind of challenges at university level, challenges they face in their supervision. What do they think their biggest challenges or obstacles or difficulties in supervising these projects tend to be? I don't know if anyone wants to jump in and kind of respond to that very broad question.
I'd say that the biggest problem is that students want to do too much. They seem to think that often, this is certainly true with our students at all levels, including master's students, that if your question isn't kind of what's everything about climate change, what's everything about gentrification, it's too big. Whereas actually often the best projects are really quite narrow in scope. So I'm going to interview 10 people in depth and find out what they think about X. Or I'm going to do a survey which is really specifically focused on quite a narrow topic, which you can look at in 10 questions. These are often the best because they're easiest to design well, and they're easiest to analyze well. And as Helen was saying, that's far more important than, I mean, these are relatively small projects. You can't answer big questions, but you can approach the question well and you can analyze it well, and that's what's really important.
I just wanted to add to that I think that the challenge is they think unless they have a big question, they can't possibly fill the number of words that they need to fill. And that's when you've got the right question, when it's small, it actually ends up being surprisingly easy to, I mean, that's a PhD, right? It's like so narrow, but yet you've written 80,000 words or something like that. So I think that the problem with big questions is you get very superficial answers. And that's the main problem that I see.
Yeah, David?
I often get asked the question as a historical geographer, the past isn't relevant, so I can't study it, or it's not valid. And of course, one of the things about the past is that you can actually access way more data sometimes than you can in the present, because everybody's, well, depending on how far back you go, everybody's dead. So you can actually get some really personal information. And a really good example of that is the current pandemic. There was some great studies of the Spanish flu that compared death rates in 2 different cities in the United States and looked at the different measures they took. This was published a few years ago. The data had already been made available. And they found that social isolation was the key to reducing the impact of the pandemic. And that was based entirely on historical research going back to 1918. So yeah, the past is relevant. It's the questions that are really important.
I'd support that, and also adding to George's comment, the real challenge is getting students to narrow down. They want to solve the biggest environmental challenges of the time. So I often start off saying, well, there are whole institutions trying to do that, and they've been trying to do it for years. So, let's focus in on a tiny part of that you can really do in the short time that you have around everything else. I think the other issue is last minutism in some students, at least. It's, I don't want to make a decision now. I'll leave it till later, and I'll keep my options open, and I'll collect all the data towards the end, and that can be a problem too, because it does need time to get this right.
You want to come in there on that, Helen?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And with that question on what's a good human investigation, good research requires you being uncomfortable for quite a long time and not quite entirely knowing what you're doing. And I think students struggle with that. So, Kev was saying you have a working research question, you get the student to near enough where they are, you don't want them, but then they kind of be uncomfortable as they work through. Writing's thinking, they have to then form the narrative. And I think students don't like that sense, because they have to be uncomfortable for weeks, sometimes months, not knowing what they're doing, and they try and close it down too early. I think a good dissertation is one where they've really worked through, taken the time to work through it, brought in the literature, and like you say, not closed it down too early. But I think sometimes they close it down because they just don't like that feeling of not knowing what they're doing.
John?
Sorry, too many monitors going on there. I think Helen's exactly right. And the idea that you write a literature review and then it's done and you move on to your methodology and then that's done and then you collect your data and that's done. I mean, the number of times that, I've started working with data and realized, I need to go back and, radically rewrite my literature review. You never get to close off those stages. There's always that feedback happening between one stage and the next. And getting them comfortable with that, I think, is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, and to add to that, because we're all marking dissertations as we speak, quite often the last meeting I'll have with a dissertation student, and that will address some of the question as well, is about this consistency of links throughout the work. So I often get, does the end of the introduction research question link to why the project is important? And does that link into why you're approaching your methods the way you're doing? If those three things link, you're putting across a consistent and threaded argument throughout your thesis or dissertation or investigation. And for me, that's what makes a good, especially human geography one, is making that link the whole way through and avoiding those kind of writing in blocks that end up having separate elements to it.
So I think I would add that, two of our key roles as supervisors is, on the one hand, to make sure that students have a narrow enough project that it's doable and doable well. But secondly, to help them to see the relationship between that very specific project and the bigger debates that it addresses. And that's what they want to address the big debates. And that's what they find difficult, to see the relationship between something very specific and the bigger debate that it is a small contribution to, but nevertheless a significant one.
The next question, I think, is a very interesting question, is are we at universities seeing improvements in students' investigative abilities following the introduction of the NEA investigation, independent investigation? I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on that. The one thing I would say is, the one thing I'm noticing is the lack of, or the reduction in fear of doing those types of projects and investigations and methods. Students seem to be, incoming students seem to be more adept at least attempting and going, okay, well, I've no problem trying those methods. That's what I've been noticing, but I don't know if anyone else wants to make a comment about that.
I hope we do see that, because I think it has been very difficult the last decade, given the lack of, given how different A-level and university teaching has been. The two seem to have converged quite a bit recently, and so I think we will see that. We've certainly, I think, seen some students who, right from the start, are much more capable of running with it than we would have done previously. It's not all students, but it is some. So I think it has made a difference. And then there's the question about, entering university without enough imagination. What would we like teachers of A-level geography to do to help with the transition to a degree? I think the challenge that students have with doing a degree is, on the one hand, the sort of the self-discipline of, the lectures and the classes and the practicals and so on are a framework and send you in a particular direction, but you need to do a lot more on your own. So there's that. But I think the other issue that students often find difficult is that their opinion really matters at university, and they have to start making up their minds about what they believe in and evidencing what they believe in with coherent arguments. It's not enough just to say X says this and Y says that. Okay, what's your conclusion then? What do you believe, and why do you believe X versus Y? And I think, that's what we try and do, of course, at university, but having students who've already done some of that, which we do of course see, is always helpful.
And just to add to that, or expand on that a bit, is what you often see with first year students is, how do I get a good mark according to the marking criteria, which comes from, as someone pointed out earlier on, comes from the A-level criteria, or comes from other reasons, where we're going, well, it doesn't really matter what that kind of criteria is. We're looking, as Mark says, to get your opinion, and that kind of critical process involved. But that comes from different things such as criteria. So there's more questions. To what extent are you seeing students with GIS experience coming in from school? I don't know if people like John and Mark, who are more attuned to the kind of GIS elements, want to respond to that.
So I've been teaching a little. I mean, it's been a couple of years since I taught any second year GIS, but obviously I teach second year programming. So in Python, and I would say, we always get a few students who have, for various reasons, taught themselves some aspect of this, but for the most part, I haven't noticed kind of a huge uptake in terms of GIS. Mark has maybe seen more on the purely physical geography side than I have, but on human geography, I haven't seen a huge change.
Maybe Chris wants to come in after, but I think there is always a little bit of reticence with students around GIS and all technical things, really, because it's there's this view that it's more difficult, and that has been true in the past. I think that these technical things have always been a very steep learning curve. That has changed with open source software, a much greater variety of software, much greater use of GIS, web-based GIS, and so on. And that's the same for the other technical parts of the subject as well. They're now much more, much simpler and much more comfortable for students, although that may still not be their perception. Chris, do you have anything to add there? We can't hear you, Chris, sorry. Okay, there's another one here. Engaging students who lack motivation. Well, I have this problem with my son at the moment, right? He's doing his NEA in computing, or should be. And, what am I getting out of him? Not very much. So I think it is problematic. But I think getting family involved, getting friends involved as you can with these sort of more home library, online garden type projects that we're having to do now, I think is helpful. And I certainly appreciate it when the school tells me what my son is or is not doing on his NEA. But I think helping students towards topics that are really driven by their interests, right? Okay, what are you interested in? And then do something on that. Helen?
Yeah, I think, although obviously all of us are nerds, and that's why we end up being academics. So, but there are those ones who are, I hate last minute, right? It scares me, but some of the students do pull it out the bag last minute because they need a deadline. And I think I have to appreciate that's how they work. And some of them do pull out. You must see it all the time with your students. I also think encouraging them, I think some of it's about fear or lack of confidence. And I think it's about, keeping encouraging them that what they're doing's, it's good and it's right. And again, like this idea that it doesn't come together quickly, and that's all right, I think is, because most of them are engaged. I think, they call it their disso. Most of them are engaged with their disso, I find. It's just about encouraging them that they're not doing badly at it and they're not stupid. And there's more than one way to skin a cat when it comes to research.
Can I just add something to that quickly? About Helen mentioned about deadlines, and I don't quite know how your relationships develop with your students, but certainly for me, at least with my dissertation students, I get a sense pretty early on whether they want deadlines along the way or whether they want to be left alone. And I think establishing that pretty early on, their best working practices, and whether they want me to actually give them some specific little chunks, little deadlines along the way, can be pretty helpful.
I was just going to say, I think one other technique that can be helpful is the idea of, in a sense, always, getting them to write short, even 2 or 3 paragraph, like, okay, so what have you read? How's it changing your thinking? Like a short reflective piece or a short summary of something that they've read that they found stimulating, so that in a sense, they're not staring at a blank page saying, how do I start writing my NEA? Because they'll spend months writing the perfect introduction only to discover, 3 weeks later that it's totally the wrong, topic. It's much better that they have lots of stuff that they've already read, already written, that they can then start cobbling together into, something, or, oh, that paragraph's really useful for, for my literature review. Oh, this was really helpful for thinking about my methodology. That's what I should be focusing on. So I think that's another way of kind of dealing with the anxiety around writing, 3,000 or 4,000 words when you don't know where to start, is just start with this little, what newspaper, what have you read in the news recently that you think is relevant, or, read this article and come back to me with a short summary.
I would. Oh,
go on. I think David had his hand first. Sorry.
I think just picking up on something that Helen said, I think we often overestimate the confidence of our students. When they're going into something that they don't know, and they're frightened of getting things wrong, they often are very underconfident. And so I think having that conversation where you give a lot of praise and you say, not yes, but yes, and have you thought of this? So actually, attitudes that promote a sense of inquiry and confidence, I think, are really important at early stages of dissertation and anything you start out from. So that's what I would say.
Helen?
Yeah, and building on that, I think it's about, I personally, for a long time, thought there was a right method. I thought, and I thought there was a right, there must be a right method that you have to do for this question, or there must be a right question to ask. And I think it's about stressing to students how research is all about the individual, and the beauty of academia is that we all think differently and come at things differently from our own strengths, and encouraging students to see that it's not like everybody has to do a quant survey of a particular question. That's not the right way, and I always tell my students, one of the best master's dissertations I've ever read was on 2 photos. She got up in the 80s, I think nearly 90s. She did it on, Earth from space and moonwalk or something, or whatever it's moonrise or whatever it's Earthrise and Earth from space, and 2 photos, and so it's about encouraging like individualism and students seeing what they've got something to bring to the table, which sort of supports what David was saying.
This kind of links into a question Martin had that seemed to have disappeared, but it's something I notice a lot with our students as well. It's this fixation on titles. I don't know if any of my colleagues here have this experience as well, that students tend to fixate and spend so long on the title of the project. And how do we deal with that? Well, I spend a lot of my time, as you've already noticed from the first session, talking about research questions and moving away from titles. But we find that a challenge as well, as you can see my colleagues from nodding along. So I don't know if anyone wants to comment about their experience of trying to move students away from fixating on titles.
I'm responsible, I think, for the question disappearing, so I'll briefly repeat it. The title is not important. I mean, it's important, but for most of us, I think it would be one of the last things we write. Often a paper, even the very last stage of research, writing it up, the title will often change 2 or 3 times while we're writing. So the title really isn't important at all. The topic is important.
David was going to add something.
I'll step back. It's not about titles. Anybody wants to come in on titles?
Well, I always focus very much on getting a very clear aim, right? Unless the aim satisfies me in terms of clarity, I don't allow the student to move forward. And the aim has then to be followed by a series of objectives, which are the means of achieving that aim. Very few of those objectives. The title will obviously in the end be based upon the aim, but I don't worry about that, or I don't worry students about that until later. Helen?
Yeah, I think I would add, I mean, in other presentations I give the hourglass. And I think Mark brought it up in that you're solving a tiny little piece of a much bigger puzzle. And to me, it's not so much about, I mean, obviously the aim as well, but it's about the opening gambit. Like what I would get students to worry about more is, what are you opening your dissertation with? Because that's the focus of your dissertation. That's where the contribution lies. So I always say to them, like, this individual piece of research that you're doing could make a contribution to so many of Kevin's, what did you call it? The topic, like I could look at place attachment, but it'd be about gentrification. I could look at place attachment, but it'd be about psychological well-being. I could look at place attachment and be about climate change, or migration. And so it's about getting the student to think about, where is my work making a contribution? And that's the opening gambit. And that to me is sort of as tricky, if not more tricky, than the title.
Yeah. So I think just time to kind of cover just quickly 2 questions that I think are important. One is from Mike: how do we deal with complete about turns or a change in topic completely, especially with quite short on time? I think that links in. I have no problem with students changing their topics, but often it's about methods, and then the limitations I was talking about with regards to questions and answering. Suddenly the limitations in time and what you can do limits what they can do. I know Chris wants to come in on this. And Chris is...
Can't hear you, Chris.
Hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that almost relates to the title question, that when students change topic, then it's so important that they focus on a research question or research aim, and set research questions and address those questions really specifically. Because if they started off kind of at the same time as everyone else, then they'd have a bit more time to kind of explore around, what exactly do I want the research questions to be, etc. Whereas if they're on a tight time period, then really having those research questions and focusing on it, addressing them, and providing all the kind of literature, summaries, etc. That's so critically important. Yeah, so again, kind of focus on the research questions, especially if they don't have much time.
David?
I just want to jump in really quickly. We don't use the F word nearly enough, I think. Students need to have fun. Dissertation should be fun. They should enjoy what they're doing. If they enjoy what they're doing, they'll do more of it and they'll do it better. So part of our responsibility and theirs as well is to find out what really, what's the fun in it? What's the enjoyment in it? Not to make it a chore. So I always emphasize to my students, play with ideas. If you start early enough, play with them, have fun, and let's see what comes out of it.
That's a very important point. So just a last question to end on is, collecting primary data under the current COVID situation is a real challenge. How is KCL approaching this with our students? Well, just to point out, I'll let other people come on more specifics, but near the end of my talk, we're talking about how we're compiling online and virtual methods of fieldwork and online sources. So they'll be sent along with this. But I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on more specifics of how they're dealing with certain students.
So as well as primary online data, which we're now encouraging those students who would otherwise have done in-person questionnaires to do. I think during lockdown, it's important to recognize that if you have access to, for example, low-cost sensing or GIS, these are lenses through which you can look at data or look at an environment in a very different way, so that you can actually do science, in your house, thermal environment, humidity environment, all sorts of things, volatile organic compounds, noise, or in your garden, in a plant pot, in an allotment, all of these sorts of things, and answer fairly sophisticated research questions that contribute to bigger questions that way. Helen?
Yeah, I was just going to say, this is, for me, it's a lot where the learning about people by not talking to people kind of end of the spectrum comes in. So I mean, I think definitely, I think phone interviews, WhatsApp, like I was saying, WhatsApp questions, you know, just basically saying, how else can I have a conversation, but in written or over the phone. But I also think this is where you start, you know, analyzing, you know, doing discourse analysis, doing policy analysis, and actually just using documents, basically. And I think you can have, or photos, you know, you can have amazing dissertations from that. So that, I think I would be sort of moving students there as well.
So just to add to that, though you might not be using primary, like you might not be using primary data collection methods, even in using the secondary data, you can create primary data from that. So it's less about thinking about it as literally being out in the field and more about kind of undertaking the practices of a researcher.
Just to pick up, you know, very briefly on something that Mark mentioned about online open source software. I mean, sometimes we need to develop new skills to access online data that we otherwise perhaps wouldn't even think about. An example of that is, you know, I'm looking at health in the 19th century. We're using parliamentary papers of people who were forced to retire because of ill health. And we're using optical character recognition to extract spreadsheets, which allow us then to begin to plot places which had greater levels of ill health. But we need that kind of software expertise. So it's important to develop new skills if you're going to do research in new ways as well.
Did you have something to add to that, John?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there are, you know, people are freely sharing immense amounts of information about themselves through Flickr, Instagram, etc., blogs, tweets. I mean, there's a gigantic, often ill-tempered conversation being carried out on Twitter. So, and geographical information is embedded in a lot of that through profile information, tags about location, things like that. So I think there are lots of opportunities to, in a sense, you know, we all need to use our imagination about alternatives. So, you know, without all of you as the audience, this could easily be an online focus group, you know, WhatsApp interviews, things like that. I think there are lots of potential translations. Obviously, the experience will be a bit different. But, you know, one of the things that I talked about in my talk is you can also take this sort of big data, big social data, and look for ways to make it small. So by zeroing in on things that relate to a particular area, a particular topic, and things like that. So I think there are a lot of ways to kind of think laterally, which is one of the things that our students struggle with. Sometimes it's things that we as staff struggle with, but I think there are opportunities that are there to kind of do some really creative, innovative things that will be genuinely new. And so hopefully you all feel sort of empowered to do that.
On Dan.
I've made perhaps a final point that we haven't really said is this idea that actually all of us over the last 2 months have had discussions with hundreds of our own students who've submitted the proposal in March or in April about a dissertation they planned to carry out and now can't. So we can all certainly empathize. And what I found, at least personally, is that they were just anxious. But when we started talking about what they could do and how they could adapt their project, actually, I don't think for any of my students, we've altered their core aim. We've just tweaked how they're going to go about getting the data and what they might sort of find out down the line. The methods they might use are clearly not going to be field-based or lab-based, but they were just anxious because they were suddenly told they can't do what they wanted to do or what they'd written about. But as soon as we started talking about it, actually, for me at least, yeah, it's gone okay, and they just needed to get past that initial barrier.
Absolutely. So just I'm going to have to end it there because we're out of time. Just to briefly answer one of the questions there is, we'll be putting everything into a pack, including this video link on YouTube and the different sources and links available. And they'll be sending out in the next few days to anyone who had registered as an attendee. And then that just leaves me to thank every one of our panelists for taking their time today, from wherever they are, from their homes, to help us out with this webinar. And thanks to participants and attendees for joining in. And please do email back when we send out that information, any feedback you have or any future sessions you think we'd like to put on, or anything you'd like to cover. So thanks everyone so much for attending and presenting. So hope again to see you again soon. Goodbye.
Bye, cheerio. Thank you, Kev.